Next speaker this morning is a former war correspondent in Cambodia. She worked for National Public Radio as the foreign editor and was a Washington Post correspondent. She worked for the New York Times. I've read her work on many occasions, and she is currently writing a book on the global tourism industry to be published by Simon & Schuster. Her views are always worth hearing. Ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Becker.
I'm going to be talking as the journalist and writer that Richard described. And I'm going to suggest that as we go through the next few days, a lot of you will be surprised by what you hear. That the industry tourism is arguably now one of the largest industries in the world, if not the largest. It employs at least 1 out of 12 people around the world. As you heard from Bruce, minimum nearing $1 billion traveling, and that's across international boundaries. You can triple that when you count the tourists within their own countries. And you say, why don't I read about this in the newspapers, see much of it on the web or in television? And I will say that reason is my fault, the industry's fault. And that's what I want to talk about today. When you read about travel, you read essentially stories that are not serious. You read stories that read more like brochures than an analysis of the kind of issues that Bruce just discussed. The media has colluded with the industry to treat tourism like an afterthought, like a parallel universe. So you read beautiful stories about traveling in India, and you don't read about the effects some of the tourism has had on the environment. You read about wonderful adventures at sunset and the great fresh seafood, but you don't read about the mess you had in terms of transportation or the government's corrupt behavior that prevents the regulations from being applied. And that's where I would expand what Bruce said about what are the difficulties in sustainable tourism. It's not just the industry, it's a lot of the government. And government is a part and parcel of the tourism industry. If the government has good regulations, that's great. If they're not applied, that's useless. So just at the moment where sustainable green tourism is exploding with the industry, where the tourism industry has become this blockbuster industry, the writers and journalists who are supposed to be the gatekeepers, who are supposed to be the ones measuring the effectiveness of the regulations, measuring whether or not something is sustainable, we've become part of the industry. There's a group in the United States of travel writers, all freelancers, that means that they don't have a staff position, who do nothing but travel around the world and write gorgeous stories about different destinations, all expenses paid. That's impossible in any other form of journalism. You can read travel sections, and without knowing it, you are reading something that was written by a writer or reporter who was paid for entirely by the destination, by the airlines company, the restaurant, the club, and so on and so forth. That would be the equivalent of being a political reporter in the United States covering a Democratic convention, and instead of reading about what's really happening, you just read about how wonderful and interesting the speeches were because the Democratic Party paid all the expenses. Well, you have that every day in every travel section. Most stories, you don't even know whether or not the writer or reporter was paid by the organization or whether they got all freebies. Now,